Thank you very much. I'm an old-fashioned kind of person, and I believe in handouts, so I prepared two of them, but I'm afraid there aren't enough copies of either one of them, so we're going to have to project on the screen. Can this be scrolled down to see what's on it? Yeah, great. Okay, like that would be good. Okay. The full paper on which this is based is about 39 pages, and it's about to be published by the Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, the A.A. Kent, the Journal of Asian and African Studies. It should be out within a few weeks, I think. I gave a short summary of this paper at the Sino-Tibetan conference in Guangzhou 2 years ago, but I only had about 10 minutes, and it wasn't very satisfactory. So the two handouts which I needed, this one and then an appendix. I thought I would add an amusing appendix about an English morpheme, a performative, which coincidentally has the same shape, to demonstrate kind of similarities and differences. And a sort of lighthearted thing before the banquet. So anyway. This is a simplified version of the Proto-Tibeto-Burman syllable canon. And these are prefixes. The innermost prefix I assume to be older, and the outer one to be newer. I can give you a simple example. The word for to lick is reconstructed this way. But in Tangkul Naga, you have a form like this. But this is clearly secondary because almost all verbs in Tangkul have the prefix k. So this one goes back to Proto-Tibeto-Burman, and this is secondary. So that's why there are two here. This is the initial consonant. This is a glide, R, L, W, Y, vowel, maybe vowel length, final consonant, and an S suffix. The status of tone at the proto level is still controversial. Some people, like my guru Benedict, believed you could reconstruct tone for Proto-Tibeto-Burman. I personally believe that tones have come and gone in the history of the family many times, because this is a language family which is hospitable to tones, tone-prone. So what I want to talk about today is the prefixes which can go back to Proto-Tibeto-Burman. These. And several are set up for Proto-Tibeto-Burman. S, M, B, D, G, R, L. These are by far the most important because they have the clearest semantic content. S is a causativizer or a transitive. M is the opposite of that, inner directed or stative meaning instead of outward directed causative or transitive. These occur sporadically and look as if they're reductions of initial syllables and compounds, although they're so ancient that it's now very hard to demonstrate that. So among these prefixes is this one, which is reconstructed as a. And I believe this is a serious oversimplification because, well, in the first place, all the other prefixes are consonantal. But in many of the daughter languages, you have this form. And it's not nice to leave out glottal stop, even though in some languages it's automatic, as in German, before a vowel. But Mary Haas used to say that if you don't write glottal stop, you might as well not write T. So I sort of believe that. So I would like to look at this prefix from 2 points of view. I call this morphosyntactic, from a morphological point of view and from a semantic point of view. So did I say morphosyntactic? I meant morphosemantic. Morphosemantic. The morphosemantics are summarized in this monstrous chart here. You notice, by the way, that this syllable canon goes beyond the simple monosyllable. Once you have prefixes, you usually get them vocalized by schwa or a or some other vowel. So it's really sesquisyllabic. Sesqui, of course, means 1.5. And this sort of syllable structure is rampant in Southeast Asia. It's a hallmark of the Mon Khmer family, and it also is very obvious in certain branches of Tibeto-Burman. So this is a necessary stage between disyllabic, sesquisyllabic, monosyllabic. And changes of syllable structure happen with distressing regularity. So what I want to do, instead of just reconstructing the ah, the full morphophonemic range of this prefix is on page 2 of this handout here. First of all, I want to reconstruct both stressed and unstressed variants. And in addition, we need both open syllable and nasal final variants. Now, this is perhaps the most difficult to accept of my hypotheses here. Ah, there it is, yes. Yeah, on this first page here, I take an arbitrary syllable ta and show what happens to it in the various languages. So, many languages have disyllabic forms with a fully syllabic ah. These include several languages described by Shintani Tadahiko. Shanke, Zotung, Zayang. Shanke is a Naga language. Zotung is a Chin language. Zayang is a Karenic language. You have Tibetan and Lahu. So many other languages in the family are of this type, fully disyllabic with an initial ah with a glottal stop. Other languages have an unstressed variant. The most important language from that point of view is Burmese, which has the unstressed variant ah with this consonant before the root. This is such a pervasive prefix in Burmese that if you start writing a dictionary of Burmese, you would have to duplicate almost every entry. Madame Bernot talked about this in that film we saw the other day, because it's an extremely productive prefix. It sometimes converts verbs into nouns, but sometimes it's just there for phonological bulk to give the word greater phonological power. Okay, now here comes something that some people might find hard to accept. There is a phenomenon which I have called rhinoglotophilia in an article written back in 1975. I know it sounds like a disease or maybe even a perversion, but by rhinoglotophilia, what I mean is the connection between glottality and nasality, and the interesting fact that syllables with initial laryngeals, H, glottal stop, or 0, very often have allophonic nasalization in them. And there are many, in the full handout, this is discussed on page 4 and 5. A language like Thai has nasalization in syllables that begin with glottal stop or H. So the word for 5, written H-A-A, is from ha, to take, ow, glottal stop A-W. Ak, to leave. Lahu is another language like that. The numeral for 4 is aw, but it's usually pronounced an. Aw to bend, ha, elephant, ha to wrap up. And you can see you can get both the nasal and the glottal feature in the same syllable. Ha has both a glottal stop and a nasal. Yiddish also has a few examples like this. The word for Jacob in Hebrew is Yaakov, but in Yiddish it becomes Yankiv or Yankel. This glottal stop is realized as a nasal in that word, many other words. My colleague John O'Hala, who's a phonetician, and I have had many discussions about the connection between nasality and glottality over the years. And he has elaborate explanations based on both articulatory and aerodynamic factors. These are discussed on page 4. I'll just quickly read through this. Vowel nasalization frequently occurs in the environment of laryngeals because, for one thing, nasal-oral coupling has negligible acoustic or perceptual effect on laryngeals, so that people are free to follow the principle of least effort, not bothering to raise the velum when it is not absolutely necessary. And secondly, there's no aerodynamic requirement for velar closure in the articulation of laryngeals. It's also true that there's a preference for low vowels in order for this nasalization to take place. And the reasons for that seem to be the main effect of nasalization on sonorants is a downward shift in the region of the first formant. Thus, the lower the first formant of a vowel is to begin with, the less apt it will be to suffer the further degradation of a downward shift. Since low vowels have higher first formants than high vowels, they are less resistant to nasalization. Okay, so what I want to claim is, can we go back to the original chart, please? This one here. That via rhinoglotophilia, there are still two kinds of results. You can either get the stress variant or the unstressed variant. The stress variant would have like a full syllable ang before the root. We're taking ta as the arbitrary root. So languages like Nikir, a lot of southern Loloish languages like Bisu, Ponoi, Lahu. The Lahu vowel o, by the way, regularly comes from ang. That's one of the main sources of o. Okay. There are further wrinkles. Some languages have a pre-palatalized variant. So Mikir, Lota, Aka seem to have a Y element or a Yod element before the prefix. Other languages go further and drop the vowel altogether, so you just have pre-nasalized initials, or in the case of Lahu, the Lahu voice series comes from an original pre-nasalized series. So you get all the way from disyllabic things like ang-ta to things like da or n-ta. Can we go up a little more, please? Scroll down a bit. Yes, there's a further development peculiar to Lahu and maybe some other languages, maybe some of you have data on other languages, where there's a variant ah in the high rising tone. And I demonstrated a long time ago that the Lahu high rising tone comes from syllables with two glottal incidents in them, a glottalized initial and a glottal stop final, which comes from final PTK. So it's a very pervasive variational process in Tibeto-Burman that you get alternation between homorganic final stops and nasals. So Lahu went a further distance and has a variant ak, which became a. So in fact, Lahu has three different a prefixes. It has a, it has o, and it has a. This one is from plain a, although the glottal stop disappears in Lahu. This is from ang, and this is from ak. Okay, now where do these variants occur? So, let's go to the first page of the other handout, where I go into the semantics of the thing. This is the one that says, which has figure A semantic flowchart of the PTB A prefix. Yes, there we are. Okay, I think the basic meaning of this prefix is something like inalienable permanence. And what are inalienably possessed things? First of all, one's own name is inalienably possessed. So typically, this prefix occurs before people's names. Kinship terms, one's relatives are things you can't get rid of. They're inalienably possessed. So there are two kinds, there's both vocative and referential. And I think in many languages, this a prefix is a marker, like in Chin languages, of the third person. And I think that ultimately comes from this kind of kinship use. Parts of the body are certainly inalienable. And genitives, things which you possess, you have more or less permanently, unless something bad happens. Okay, so these are nouns. But then the prefix also occurs with verbs. With colors are sort of ambiguous in Tibeto-Burman between nouns and verbs. They have verbal qualities and they have nominal characteristics. But colors are also, even though things can change in color, that's sort of inalienable. If a house is green, it's not going to turn red tomorrow. And then by extension, you get adjectives, which in Tibeto-Burman and Southeast Asia in general are really stative verbs. And qualities are things which are more or less inherent. So you can see how quasi-permanent qualities could extend to that. And finally, you even get action verbs with this prefix sometimes. A verb which is nominalized is more permanent in a way than if it hasn't been nominalized. And then finally, showing bleaching of function, you sometimes get this prefix where there's no good reason for it, but it seems it's there for phonological bulk. So morphologically, it's complicated, and semantically, it's kind of complicated. But, and it's also true that in some languages, an ang prefix is differentiated semantically from an a prefix. But that doesn't mean necessarily that they don't have the same origin, because once things have different forms, they can undergo semantic divergence, which is what has happened. So one side benefit of this paper, I think, is to discuss the mysterious Tibetan letter called A-chung, which seems to have both nasal and glottal characteristics, as we'll see in the later part of the paper. Okay. Speaking of nasality, let's look at the different possibilities there are for nasal consonants in Tibeto-Burman. This is on page 5 of the bigger handout. So sometimes you get a nasal consonant plus a full vowel, as in lota. Go up a little bit. Yes, there we are. Yeah. Sometimes you get a nasal consonant plus schwa, like m in Jingpo, a very common prefix. Sometimes you get a syllabic nasal homorganic with a root initial, like mb, which you also get in Jingpo. Sometimes you get a glottal stop plus a full vowel plus a nasal consonant, ang. Sometimes you get that, except it's unstressed and becomes ng. Sometimes the nasal consonant disappears altogether and you just have nasalization of the vowel. You have a. And then sometimes you suffer disappearance of the vowel, apheresis of the vowel, and you just have a monosyllabic root, b, b, b. Okay, and this is analogous to the continuum of erosion of nasal final consonants that you find, say, in Lolo Burmese, where the proto-rhyme am in modern Burmese is reduced to a, but in Lahu, the nasality has disappeared altogether and is replaced by a difference in quality of the vowel. Okay. So now let's go back page 2 of this handout, which says semantics of the A prefix. So the stressed version of the prefix A occurs widely in kinship terms. Wolfenden, the great pioneer in Tibeto-Burman morphology, his 1929 book, Outlines of Tibeto-Burman Linguistic Morphology, noted that it occurs widely in kinship terms. Some written Tibetan kinship terms are listed on the bottom of the page. By the way, I just received a copy of Yankee Modi's Milang grammar, and there on page 120, she talks about A being used with kinship terms. So in that macro Tani language also, you get the same thing. Okay, going on to Jingpo. Jingpo has a prefix which used to be written A, but Laurent Moran changed it, made it more accurate to and later revised it to with a glottal stop. And Moran was the first to observe that vocative forms of kinship terms, which begin with a sonorant, are pronounced with glottalized initials. So, daughter-in-law, nam rather, na, elder sister, father, wa, grandma, oi, maternal cross cousin, ning, mother, nu, and so forth. Leroux was the first to note that there were pre-glottalized initials in Jingpo. That's a big discovery. Okay, Lahu has two kinship prefixes, a, which is usually vocative, and o, from ang. These are both used in kinship terms. The a tends to be vocative, and the o is more referential. Okay, we already mentioned genitive constructions and the pronominal prefixes in languages like the Chin group. But sometimes it's, the function of this prefix is quite elusive, and I'm forced to just have refuge in the concept of phonological bulk. So for example, sha in Lahu means meat or a game animal, but in compounds it means flesh. So you get va is pig, va sha is pork, but if you have the prefix o or sha, it always means meat or flesh. It cannot mean animal. So here, it's not just phonological bulk exactly, but it's some kind of semantic differentiation. By the way, you often get cognate object constructions in Lahu where you have a noun with the o prefix and then the identical verb without the prefix. So ti is to wrap something, or ti means a package. So it's kind of a nominalizer there. But then you get constructions like o ti ve to wrap a package. It also is a classifier. So o ti te ti means one package. So you can say o ti te ti ve. You have three instances of ti. The first one is with the prefix o, and it's a noun. The second one is just ti without the prefix, and it's a verb. And then you can get it after a numeral, where it's a classifier. So in the full version of the paper, I give a lot of examples of the fully stressed prefix. I already mentioned the languages discussed by Shintani, Shanke, Zotung, Zayen. There are others too. The Tangkul Naga has the same prefix. A recent dissertation has the identical prefix in Tangkul Naga. Okay, looking at Southern Loloish now, page 6, we see in languages like Bisu, Punoi, Bien, which is another language studied by Shintani, you get sometimes the full syllable ang. Sometimes it's reduced to just the nasalized vowel an. And in the case of Lahu, it becomes o. Rawangish used to be called Nungish, but that's an inaccurate term. You get the unstressed variant, very ung. Wadam Kong, another language studied by Shintani, has both the a and the ang. And they have slightly different functions. But as I said before, just because they might have slightly different functions doesn't mean they necessarily can't go back to the same root. Okay, so now I would like to take up the interesting question of this Tibetan letter, which is called A-chung, or little a. And this has been highly controversial in the field. Lots of people have different ideas as to what it stood for. And there are lots of different ways of writing it. If you see on page 8, different scholars have very different ways of writing it. Now, A-chung occurs in 3 positions in the written Tibetan syllable, one of which is less important than the others. We won't talk about it too much. It occurs either initially before a vowel or pre-consonantally. In a pre-vocalic position, it seems to have a glottal feature. So in some dialects of Tibetan, you actually get a velar fricative, like r or ch, before the vowel, where you have A-chung before a vowel. It sometimes is r, sometimes ch, sometimes glottal stop, in the various dialects. Pre-consonantally, it's a different story. Pre-consonantally, it definitely seems to be a nasal. And there's all kinds of evidence for this. In Jackson Sun's MA dissertation on a dialect of Indo-Tibetan, Dzogchen Indo-Tibetan, he points out that written Tibetan A-chung before a consonant corresponds to prenasalization in the Amdo dialect. There are examples here on page 10. We have these 2 columns, written Tibetan and Dzogchen Amdo. Okay, so in written Tibetan, where you get the A-chung, in this dialect of Amdo, you get prenasalization. Same thing happens with the m-prefix. So how come Tibetan has 2 nasal prefixes? It has both the m and the A-chung. And again, Jackson has a good explanation for this. The m prefix in Tibetan was undoubtedly pronounced something like this. Because if you get 2 nasals in a row without some kind of vowel in there, it's kind of difficult to pronounce. You can't really say that. So this represents a kind of sesquisyllabic sequence. So you have this minor syllable and the major syllable, a syllable and a half. But in the case of prenasalized ones, native speakers aren't aware necessarily that there were 2 phonetic features of it. For them, it's just a single sound. And so to write it this way would be, with the actual m prefix, would be not very consonant with native speakers' intuitions. So what they have in common, though, these 2 prefixes, m before a consonant and A-chung before a consonant, is that they only occur before voiced sounds or aspirated sounds, not before simple surds. So you get things like makase or maga, making things up, but you don't get maka. So obviously they have some kind of relationship, and in the dictionaries they occur one after the other. You get the order of the prefixes in Tibetan dictionaries. This is on page 12. Is G, D, B, M, A-chung, RLS, and so forth. So the M and the A-chung are recognized to be similar. Okay. Other pieces of evidence for that, this is on page 11 now, that in Central and Western dialects of Tibetan, in compounds with a second element begins with A-chung, the latter is sometimes pronounced with a nasal onset. So my written Tibetan pronunciation is not so good, but let's say Tigerdun becomes Gendun, Ka-udon becomes Kandun, and so forth. So it's a nasal. Interestingly, there are good correspondences between words with written Tibetan A-chung and Proto-Tibeto-Burmese cognates with pre-nasalized initials. As I said before, when you have a voiced consonant in Lahu, that comes from a pre-nasalized initial in Proto-Tibeto-Burmese. So you get several examples of written Tibetan words with A-chung, which correspond, say, to Lahu words with voiced initials. So to drink, do in Lahu, a tung, or ja, a drop, ju to prick or stick, ja to sneak or sling. This one is not so great because it goes back to jak, not to jap. But they look kind of related. Even in written Burmese, the word for this is di. This might be a relatively recent word in Burmese, but it shows the same kind of tendencies. Okay. Post-vocalically, A-chung is only an orthographic device, so we're not going to talk about that too much. Okay, going to page 12 now. There are interesting examples of the prenominal use of A-chung, which show variation between A-chung and another prefix. So flee, jiba, lejiba, head, go, mago, jig, majig for neck, another word for neck, word for tadpole. We don't have a proto-form for that. So it looks as if there might have been more than one prefix to those particular words. Okay, and there are various correspondences you can find. These are kind of random examples among our prefixal variants across subgroups of Tibeto-Burman. So there are correspondences between A-chung in Tibetan and syllabic nasal in Lota. Some nice examples: jibspa to suck, ntsup to kiss in Lota, to suck face, as some people say. Insect, another one, bu angbao. Correspondences between A-chung and mikir ing. Correspondences between m and ang, words for liver and stinking smell. Between m and mikir ing ang. Yeah. And we get to mikir and a. We don't have to go into all these details. Yeah. So the main thing I want to leave you all with is that several different variants of the prefix have to be reconstructed. Stressed and unstressed, post-nasalized or not post-nasalized, palatalized or not, and it's much more complex and interesting than if we just reconstruct a for the prefix. Okay. And last but not least, we should mention Chinese, of course, because a in the fully stressed form occurs in many Chinese kinship terms. This is page 14. And finally, some remarks about Indo-European parallels. Proto-Indo-European scholars reconstruct two syllabic nasals, and but in many of the daughter languages, there are partially vocalic reflexes of this. So Proto-Indo-European cum tom, 100. In Latin, you get centum, you get en as the result. In the 10 decum, reconstruct that way, you get em. and these other examples. Immortal is a privative or negative prefix syllabic n, and it becomes a in Sanskrit and Greek. A privative is sometimes called amrta. Ambrotos is where we get the word ambrosia. It was the drink which made the gods immortal. Immortalis in Latin. You get un in English with a vowel, in Latin. The word for foot, it's also an accusative suffix, pedum, poda in Greek, pedem in Latin, the accusative. The difference is that in Indo-European, the nasal component is viewed as primary, with the vocalic element treated as secondary. But in my way of looking at things, I consider the nasal component to be secondary, and the nasal component should be secondary to the glottal component. But this could be a distinction without a difference, because how can you pronounce these things without putting in vowels, even at the proto form? You've got to have some kind of schwa-like thing in there. Okay, so now for the amusing part of the talk. And that's the other handout. The first page is just the semantics of the root. But then I would like to talk a little bit about a very obscure English element. I don't want to call it a prefix because native speakers are unaware that it has any particular meaning right now. So let's call it a preformative. And coincidentally, the reason I picked this is because coincidentally, the form is a. And everybody knows, all historians of the English language know, that this preformative comes from an old English locative morpheme, an or on, with meanings like modern English in or at or on. And this Old English form, an or on, was reduced in medieval and modern English to a. And it has slightly different functions before nouns, or as opposed to before verbs. Before nouns, it occurs with a lot of general words, but also especially with nautical terms, that is, seafaring words. Before verbs, it has a state of meaning or a durative meaning. So look at all these words referring to words that you need when you're sailing the sea. Aback, abaft, abeam, aboard, aground, you run aground. Alee means in the shadow of the wind. Aloft is up in the rigging. Aport, asea, this one is still used. Ashore is still used. Athwart, away. 100% of American children, when they hear the expression anchors away, there was a song, Anchors Away, from World War II, we think it means away, A-W-A-Y. You pull up the anchors, so the anchors are away. But there's an expression to weigh anchor that means the same thing, to pull up the anchor. For some reason it's called to weigh anchor. And this is how it's written. Okay, and then there are notes of these various things. If you're interested, you can, I'll be glad to send you copies of it. Then there are a lot of general locatives. Like about, above, abreast, abroad, across, afar, afield, afoot, against, ahead, along, amid, among. Some aren't used anymore. Around, aside, aslant. Aslant, I find in Hamlet, we're talking about Ophelia. There is a willow grows aslant a brook, which means slanting over the brook. But nobody uses that anymore. So a lot of these are archaic. Can we keep scrolling? Yeah, this is a Scottish word, agley, a famous verse, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang off to gley, often go wrong. A weary is also appears in Shakespeare. I begin to grow weary of the sun and wish the estate of the world were now undone. Can you keep going? With action verbs, a was used fairly freely. Words like a swim, a swoon, a swing, the act of swimming. And this still exists in some dialects of English. Some older people still use expressions like this. They're considered dialectal. So I'm just a-sitting in the sun, warming my old bones. It has to be used with the progressive form of the verb, with the ing suffix. They were running and shouting like a bunch of lunatics. Another example from Shakespeare in King Lear, when King Lear's beloved daughter Cordelia is being hanged at the end of the play, King Lear actually kills a guy who was trying to hang her, and said, "I killed the slave that was a-hanging thee." That was in the act of hanging you. So that's from like at hanging. It was about the act of hanging. So a lot of these expressions are archaic, obsolete, or moribund. So some examples here. We still say a fire, but on fire is now much more common. Atop is kind of literary, on top, we say. A sea we can still say, but at sea is more common. Atone, that's interesting. To atone for a sin, that actually comes from at one, in agreement. Asleep, this is still very common. Everybody says asleep. Akin is still used. Aloud is still in common use. A bed, it's quaint now, we say in bed. A bloom is poetic, we say in bloom. A flame we can say, but it's sort of literary, in flames. Okay. Now, another point I want to make is that there are lots of words which begin with a, which have nothing to do with this particular prefix. Some derive from an intensitive prefix. A lot of words are from Romance languages, especially from French, where the first element is a, but that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Yeah, all these things. If you look through the dictionary, you find many, many, many. Some of them look very much like they should be native English. Across, for example, it's one of these spatial things, but it's actually from French, à quoi, or en quoi. Afraid is from French, effrayé. Agog, angug, in merriment. Apart, apace, apiece, astray. We even have a word from Malay, amok, to run amok, but that is that's a different story for that. Okay, so now the point I want to make, differences and similarities between these two prefixes, the Proto-Tibeto-Burman one and this English prefix. Both of the prefixal elements, both of these elements can be traced back to the same proto-semantic entity, but this is different in the two cases. In the Tibeto-Burman case, I'd say the proto-semantics is inalienable possession. In English, it's locativity, locative. There are different etymological statuses among the various examples that exemplify the English preformative, so they don't all come from the same source, but I claim that all the morphophonemic variants of the Tibeto-Burman prefix are etymologically related. In the English case, the origin of the preformative is quite clear, comes from at or on, but in Tibeto-Burman, Sino-Tibetan, no independent morpheme can be identified as the form that was reduced to become a. And something which is a total coincidence, both prefixal elements involve nasal variants, though this is entirely coincidental. In the case of English, the nasal final, as in modern English in and on, was there originally, but disappeared in unstressed position. In the Tibeto-Burman case, on the other hand, I claim the nasal element to be secondary, a product of minor glottophilia. A minor point, there's no particular connection with colors in the history of English a, although this is a crucial semantic category in the case of the Tibeto-Burman prefix, since it has both nominal and verbal characteristics, words for color. Similarities. Both the Tibeto-Burman and the English prefixes have to be reconstructed with stressed and unstressed variants. And in both Tibeto-Burman and English, the pre-nominal use of the prefix seems to have been basic, but in both cases, their usage was widened to include pre-verbal usage as well. And another point they have in common is, once these prefixal elements were well established, they were generalized and could be affixed to loan words as well as to native words. We saw those words from French, which look very much like their native English words. And by coincidence again, both the Tibeto-Burman and the English prefixes have affinities to the notion of stativity. Something which is inalienably possessed stays put, and something that has a locative meaning often refers to a more or less permanent position in space. So even though these prefixes have absolutely nothing to do with each other historically, there are interesting similarities and differences between them. I think I'll stop right there. Thank you.